everyone. I'm Kate, and I'm one of the directors here at Pharma Brands. And here at Pharma Brands, our focus is improving AI literacy in healthcare. Now, we do this by things like this, lots of events, lots of training in person and virtually all across the world now, which is very exciting. So a little bit of housekeeping. Please do share questions via the chat. I'm seeing them, I'll see them come through, and I'll do my very best to get them answered. So what are we here to talk about today? Let's start with a story. So this is Tom. He's my partner. And can anyone guess what's wrong with him? He pulled his hamstring while running the dad's race at last week's sports day. He didn't even win. Now, tying us into today, can anyone guess where he went first? Did he go to our physio friend who lives next door? Did he go to his GP? No, the first place he went, exactly, I can see things coming through on the chat. The first place he went was ChatGPT. Now, Tom is now the norm. And the first place he went for healthcare advice and sympathy was ChatGPT. But how do we know that the content he's getting is accurate? This is exactly why today's conversation matters. GEO is such a complex topic, and it's the first step in most patients and HCP's journey. So we really need to make sure that the content we're creating in pharma that goes through such a vigorous review process, and very much rightly so, is found. But how do we do that? Now, I'd like to really welcome our two speakers for today, who are both living this at the moment. Now, Mansi is a director of channel enablement expert at Astellas, and she's had years and years working in digital transformation. And like I said, she's currently working on GEO with Meredith. Now, Meredith is the practice leader of integrated intelligence at Real Chemistry, where she leads analytics and intelligence. And she's been doing this also for a long time across digital, social, comms. So, and they, like I said, I'll leave you ladies to, well, introduce yourself. But they've been working together on some GEO work that we're chuffed to bits that you're joining us. So over to you.
Thanks so much, Kate. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about Generative Engine Optimization, or GEO, in pharma. As many of you know, this is a topic that has moved very quickly from interesting trend to very real business priority. Seems like only a year or two ago that many of our clients were asking, are patients and HCPs really using AI for health information? And to your point, Kate, today the answer is clearly yes. So the more important question today is, when they ask AI about a disease, a treatment option, or a clinical decision, what answer are they getting? And are we doing anything to shape that answer responsibly? So I'm Meredith Owen. I'm a practice leader at Integrated Intelligence, or Chemistry. My work sits at that intersection between healthcare analytics, communication strategy, digital behavior, and now increasingly AI-enabled discovery. So GEO is a natural extension of the work my team does, because it asks a very practical question. As AI becomes this gateway for healthcare information, how do we understand what it's saying? I'm also really happy to be joined by Mansi from Astellas, who brings really the client and business perspective to this conversation. She has firsthand experience with what it actually takes to move from this is an interesting analysis to this is something teams can use. So today you're going to hear me talk through most of the GEO methodology and practical framework, but I'll invite Mansi in a few moments to talk about what this looks like from inside a pharma organization. So Mansi, I'll let you do a quick intro as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Meredith. So my name is Mansi Jaju, and I'm the Director of Channel Enablement at Astellas. I have a ton of experience working across both medical affairs and commercial organizations with the digital transformations. My focus has been on building compliant, scalable channel ecosystems that connect scientific evidence to meaningful HCP engagement. So it's not just about making the content available. That's not where our work ends. We have to make it truly accessible and useful in the moments that matter, right? So a lot of what we talk about today comes from the work, helping organizations, helping brand teams, making their content more discoverable, more trusted, and ultimately more actionable in this AI-driven landscape.
Thanks, Monty. So to start, I want to ground us all in the shift that is happening. Search has become more fragmented. A patient or HCP may still go to Google, but they might also be using PubMed, professional resources, but now also ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, Reddit, TikTok, YouTube. So the path to a health answer is clearly no longer linear. It's no longer one platform, one query, one click. Importantly, really, these different platforms that you see on this slide are shaping very different answers. And while Google may prioritize one mix of sources, AI overviews may synthesize from another. And for pharma teams, that really means that discoverability is no longer about just whether your website ranks. It's about whether the right information exists across the ecosystem. So, Monty, from a client perspective, how does this fragmentation change the way teams need to think about content and channel strategy?
Yes, absolutely. And I think from a pharma perspective, that this is probably the most fundamental shift that we are seeing. Historically, we have designed everything around the assumption that the website is the destination. Like if we get the user, our end user there, we control their experience. Well, that assumption is no longer true. Because today, as you said, that discovery is happening across this fragment ecosystem. We have to move from thinking about channels as destination to thinking about content as something that needs to work everywhere. I feel like in the GEO work we are doing, we are seeing that clinical questions produces different answers depending on where it is being asked, which means your content strategy has to account for that variability. So this is really becoming less about channel planning and just like, content strategy, but it's more about this whole ecosystem orchestration. If your content only works for your website, you're effectively invisible in the AI first environment. So it is about making your content discoverable and accessible to the HCPs, payers, and patients.
Exactly. And, I think to that point, Mansi, we all have unique healthcare journeys, but one of the things that I, find to be really beautiful is that in healthcare, every journey starts with a question. So before a patient fills a prescription, someone asks, what are my options? Is this normal? Before a physician writes a prescription, they may be asking, what does latest evidence show? How should I be thinking about this specific patient? And what has changed now is that many of those questions, as we're talking about, are being asked to AI, which creates some important implications. First is that every question is a signal of unmet need. And when people ask AI a question, they're often revealing a gap in available information, but the way they're actually asking those questions is inherently changing as well. They aren't asking questions the same way they search Google. They're often longer, more conversational, more contextual. And the final implication is that every asset, like you were just saying, Monty, now has to function as answer media. And for me, and as I'm talking to other leaders in our industry, this is really one of the biggest mindset shifts. And really, as we look at some of the trends, the point in terms of some of the data points on this slide is that AI might not one day affect healthcare search. It already is. We see physicians are actively using AI tools in their practice, and that health-related conversations and searches are happening at moments, especially when people may not have immediate access to a clinician, a pharmacist, or a nurse or a care team. So, in this way, AI is profoundly shaping what the typical journey looks like. And you can see that visually when you compare traditional search versus AI search. So, on the left on this slide, we have the traditional search experience. You search for something like GLP-1 drugs and weight loss efficacy, you get a list of results. You still have to choose, where do you go next? How do you interpret it? But on the right, you'll see AI collapses that process into a singular synthesized answer. And that's really useful for the user because it reduces friction, but it also changes the strategic challenge for pharma, as you were just saying, Mansi. This is why GEO is not simply SEO with a new label. So, Mansi, how do you explain that difference between SEO and GEO to your integrated teams?
Yes. And I think the simplest way to explain this to anyone is SEO gets you indexed. GEO determines how you're understood, right? And SEO is absolutely foundational, and we definitely need to continue to focus on that. But it was built for a world where users compare multiple links, you click around, and you find the right answers. The AI search or GEO completely changes that. It collapses all of those links into a single synthesized answer. And we are seeing this a lot more, which is the zero-click trend, where as humans, we are now believing the answers that are come up with these GPTs, LLMs. So the question is no longer, are we visible? The question is, how are we being represented inside that answer that a patient is going to believe, right? And in pharma, that distinction really matters because AI is compressing complex clinical data into very short summaries for even healthcare professionals. This is why we start to see issues around benefit risk imbalance or a loss of nuance for a particular medication, or even misinterpretation of some differentiation factors. So in GEO, we have to change our mind shift from ranking to representation, from keywords to actually real world questions, which is prompting, from pages to answer units, and then stop thinking about traffic and start thinking about influence and your source authority in the answers. What we are doing in practice is evaluating not just whether the brand appears, but also how it is framed relative to competitors, whether the key messages are retained, whether they're accurate, whether the clinical nuance is preserved. And this is where I would say content, medical, and analytics will all have to kind of come together, because you're not just competing for clicks or ranking on the things, you're competing for the narrative control and that AI generated answer.
Exactly. And I think this is why, and we've talked about this, Monse, AI search really matters more in healthcare than really any other categories, because these health answers influence real decisions. You know, they may influence whether someone talks to a doctor, what they ask in an appointment. And so, you know, as we've talked about, AI answers are shaped by this entire digital ecosystem: web properties, medical and scientific sources, clinical guidelines, earned media, social content, this broader search infrastructure. So, Monse, this ecosystem view, this is where, you know, GEO, as you were just saying, becomes bigger than one team. Who needs to be involved? Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that we learned firsthand as we were working through this whole discovery of GEO. So this is where GEO becomes much bigger than a single team, because when you look at how these AI answers are constructed, it's not just pulling from our own websites. It is pulling from clinical literature, the PubMeds of the world, the open literature sites. It is pulling in from the guidelines published by, regulatory authorities across the world. It is pulled in from third-party content, right? Which is, the Cleveland Clinic, the Ohio clinics, the bigger websites that do put in disease state and drug information, any kind of earned media. And then obviously your technical and content infrastructure does impact that as well. So owned content is just part of the equation, right? Which means you definitely need your brand teams focused on this. But in addition to that, you need to be very closely collaborating with your medical teams, with your market access teams, with your patient centricity teams, with teams that are collaborating with these third-party influential websites, and obviously very closely collaborating with your legal and regulatory, because there are nuances that happens to make a difference with US, with European markets, with Japanese markets that you have to consider as well. So what we are seeing right now in our organization specifically is that the biggest challenge is not capability. It is ownership. It is fixing who does what, who decides what change, and how do you connect these insights into real action. The teams that are moving fastest are the ones that embed GEO in their existing operating model. And I cannot emphasize this more. It is not something that you say is something that is new and you do it as an add-on. No, it has to be incorporated in everything that you do today, whether it's creating content for your own websites, or you're creating content for these external third-party websites. It's not a separate experiment. It has to be part of our day-to-day working, because no one owns the answer. The algorithm decides that for you.
I think that's such an important point. And, I think with that context, moving to this next part of the webinar, we're going to get into a little bit more about what GEO is, how to think about it, and apply it in some of the ways Monse was just talking about. So The way we like to think about GEO is really through these three dimensions. The first is visibility, which is not only how often your company or brand is being mentioned in AI answers, but importantly, how prominently and in what position. The second is authority. So, what sources are being used to support the answer? Are they the sources that should be shaping that conversation? And the third is the narrative and clinical framing we've been talking about. So, how is the brand, but also the disease area or the category being summarized? And this framework allows us to approach GEO in a thoughtful and disciplined way. So, Monty, you were just talking about how this really can't be treated as a one-off experiment. And it's important to really put a structure around GEO. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yes, absolutely. And I cannot agree more that it needs structure more than ever because it's such a I would say, upcoming topic, and everybody's excited about it, and everybody wants to do something about it. Unless we formalize and we provide a structure, teams are going to just be reactive, right? They'll test a prompt, they'll see something unexpected, they'll fix that one thing, and they'll move on with their life, right? But that does not scale. That approach is not scalable, and it could be misleading. So, in terms of putting the structure, obviously, we need to have a repeatable way to identify patterns, diagnose the root causes, and then prioritize those actions, right? And I completely aligned with your structure you just mentioned, which is around understanding our inclusion, our authority, and then our narrative framing or accuracy, right? It gives the teams to a shared language to work with. We can go headless analysis and put our baselines, talk about where we want to where we want to be, talk about our prioritized actions, and see if we move the needle in the next 6 months doing those things, right? It's not just experimenting about AI tools, it's about building a very scalable discipline with our cross-functional teams. One of the things that we are doing is we are defining the work in 3 pillar categories. The first pillar being what can we do with our own content, right? That's our biggest lever at this point. The second pillar being what can we do with third-party influential content? Can we go and influence some of the content that is placed here? And the third one being what can we do from a content hygiene, technical hygiene perspective? How can we make it better, right? Some real-life examples is in terms of our own content, are we following the answer-first architecture? Are we putting the benefits before the risks? Are we putting the FAQs in place? In terms of your technical hygiene, we have to think about, are your schemas accurate? Is your SEO working perfectly? Do you have HTMLized content or just PDF? Do you have transcripts next to your videos, right? Some of these very basic things really make a difference on whether you show up in an AI answer versus not. So we are trying to put more discipline on how we measure and how we focus on this work for our brands at Stellas.
And exactly to your point, Monty, I think that's why like you were saying, it's not just about asking what's our share of answer in AI search and stopping there. It's really about getting more specific with our questions so they're actionable. Instead of like, again, what's our share of answer? Let's look at when someone asks about treatment options, who gets mentioned? When someone asks about safety, what evidence is cited? And this is where we can start to take visibility, which previously was just about did we rank, into more of a visibility plus context framework. And that's really why when we think about share of answer, it's really about bringing in also that narrative and framing context to truly make it actionable and identify some of the quick wins that you were talking about, Mansi. So now that we've talked about the shift in the definition, let's get a little bit practical. And I know, Mats, you started speaking to how your organization is approaching this, and you spoke to some of the process that we've kind of outlined on this slide for an effective GEO strategy setting project. And when we kicked off our work together, very much the first phase was really focused on that query intelligence, ensuring that we started with the right questions. And the way that we approach that is mining not only real-world search behavior, but also questions that audiences are asking on social, customer journey insights, and This is important because the answers will vary depending on how the question is being asked. The next phase is really getting into that audit that we've been talking about. And this is where we actually run those prompts across platforms like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, Google AI overviews, and look at whether the brand appears, how prominently it appears. Moving into that third phase is where we go beyond just what's showing up at the answers and get into that ecosystem assessment. This is what really keeps GEO grounded and allows us to look really underneath the answer and understand, to your point, Mansi, not only what third-party sources are being cited, but how are our owned assets being indexed? As everything on our website that should be crawlable, is the content structured clearly, for example? And then you also talked a lot about measurement, which we'll get to here in a second. But top line, measurement is what really is where we turn GEO into something that teams can track and action against ongoing. And that really ties into this fifth phase, which is activation. The analysis really shouldn't end with a report that says, here's what AI says. It should be an action plan: what content to create, what technical barriers to fix, what sources to strengthen. So when we conduct a GEO audit, we typically organize the work into four components: visibility and positioning analysis, that source and authority analysis, narrative framing, and then the performance and impact scoring. We're really diagnosing the brand's AI position and the ecosystem conditions that created it. So to get to like a real life example, and this is a simplified example, but it shows the kind of findings that can come out of this work. In this example, you can see the competitor actually owns the default position. And while this example, the brand is visible but not leading, AI is actually leading with risks of the treatment, not necessarily benefits. So every brand has some version of this story. Sometimes the story is we're not showing up. Sometimes it's we're showing up, but not for the questions that matter most. Sometimes it's we're visible, but the answer is outdated. And the value of GEO is that it helps teams move from a vague concern that AI might not be getting this right to a really specific diagnosis of here is where the answer is breaking down, here's why, and here's what we can do about it. So Monty, when you look at findings like this, or when thinking on the project we did together, what makes a finding most useful for a client team?
Absolutely. So when we look at outputs like this, the key question is, can a team actually do something with this, right? Because insights are only as valuable as if they translate into an action. So we have to structure our findings in a way that pinpoints to the root cause. So if there's a content gap, are we not answering the question? And if we want to, what exactly is the content that we need to put on our website? Like getting really granular on that finding. Is there a technical issue, right, in terms of AI not being able to access and interpret the content that we have put out there? Is there an authority issue, right? Are we not being cited by a trusted source? So let's go and fix that. Or is it a governance issue where does no one own the fix and we need to kind of figure it out? Then we separate out what can be done immediately versus what requires a longer term fixing or changes, right? For example, restructuring content or adding answer formats can be quick wins, whereas influencing publications or guidelines is more strategic, long-term kind of action that will come out. The most effective insights are the ones that connect directly to business priorities and customer experience, because ultimately, this is all about how patients and HCPs and payers receive the information. It's not just improving the visibility, it's improving their understanding, the scientific understanding of the drugs and the disease state.
Great. And to your point, Mansi, I think when we look specifically at how to optimize owned content for AI visibility, the inherent tenets aren't necessarily dramatically different from how we think about SEO. This is really where GEO and SEO connect. Technical SEO still matters, as we've talked about. Content structure still matters. Authority still matters. But the end goal is really what expands. And so when we think about optimization, it usually falls into three buckets. And the first really is that technical SEO and AI readiness that we've been talking about. Site structure, accessibility, schema, crawlability, all of those things are still very important. But the second is that narrative and content strategy. And this is really where we need to be understanding how our narrative and our messaging are being pulled through based on that ecosystem of digital content shaping these answers. And the third is that authority and influence building. We know from these analyses that while optimizing owned content is important, AI systems often rely on broader authority signals. Clinical sources, third-party sites are very important. So we need to account for the fact that GEO cannot live only on the brand site. It needs to exist in a broader ecosystem of trusted information. And this can seem like a lot in terms of where do you start? And I think that's where, Monty, one of the things we've learned together is like the key is really prioritization. Not every finding needs the same level of action, and a really strong GEO strategy is what helps teams decide really what to do first. And then we mentioned measurement earlier, and this is what really turns GEO from a one-time audit into a truly ongoing strategic capability. And GEO can be measured in different ways and at different cadences. We've worked with clients who want to establish a baseline, for example, before a launch or a milestone. It may be important for your company or brand to monitor ongoing performance in a specific category. Or it may be more strategic to specifically do focus looks around congresses, label updates, competitive events. The important point is that GEO measurement should be tied to action. And the score is really only useful if teams know what levers can be used to move it. So in closing, Monty, what is the one thing you would encourage pharma teams to take away from this?
I think if I can summarize all the work that I have done with the whole GEO initiative so far is start thinking about LLMs, large language models, as one of your additional audience as you create content, as you create websites, as you kind of pull together your strategy. So your job is not just to create this information flow for healthcare professionals, patients, and payers. It is also now to cater to this new audience called LLM, because until and unless LLMs are able to, AI is able to read through your content, it will not surface the right answers to your end user. So Pharma has a real opportunity here to ensure that the information that our customers, patients, HCPs are getting is evidence-based, it is balanced, and it is clinically correct. Because that does not happen by default. If anybody thinks like that, no, it doesn't. You have to start somewhere and treat GEO as a capability, not as a one-time initiative, right? Pick a focused use case, align cross-functionally, and start building from there. Because right now, people are already asking AI about your brand. And the real question is, are you shaping what they see?
Thank you, Monty. I think that's a perfect way to close today's discussion, but we're excited to take any questions.
Yeah, please do put your questions in the chat. We've had loads come through, so thank you so much. And thanks, ladies. Love that. I guess building on from what you were saying just then, Mansi, it's new. And often when things are new, it's hard you don't have the governance in place. You don't necessarily have a line in the budget. It's hard. So when you were thinking about this, I guess, how did you convince leadership to invest in GEO? And obviously you've just gone through the metrics as well, Meredith, which was awesome, but like it's still so difficult to quantify. So yeah, how did you, some stakeholder management advice, please, Mansi?
Absolutely. So the one thing I will advise against is do not sign up for a revenue uplift, because at this point it is impossible to rationalize that anything you did for GEO is going to tie together for more scripts, right? Or a revenue uplift. So that is something that you need to kind of push back on at the moment. What I think worked for me is I was able to prepare evidence to show our leadership how AI is surfacing incorrect narrative for some of our brands and how some of the brands were not even showing up. So if somebody was to ask a question about one of our brands, a competitor brand was showing up instead. So that was my best way to convince them, hey, AI is not working like I told a second ago. it is all done on purpose. It does not happen by default. So if you're not doing something, your competitors are taking that AI answer space. And then ultimately, you have to track measurement, right? So all said and done, I have to show progress. I have to show everything I'm doing is going to improve. So having those measurement KPIs, which is the share of answer, our narrative positioning, our AI visibility, citation authority, all of that is extremely important as well, because what you need to do is create a baseline, create all these prioritized actions, execute the low-hanging fruits, and then measure again and show your leadership that the needle is moving. Right? I think that is the best way to continue to get funding, get support from your stakeholders to do this ongoing measurement.
Cool. Now, I think another thing that a lot of people are dialing in from across the world, and a lot of people are dialing in from who work on global, not just in one market. So obviously, a lot of content we produce is behind a gate, or you can only access it if you're in a certain country because it's gone through that review process. So how does that work when it comes to AI? Because how can it search that? And if it is that approvable? Or how do you come across that? Or do you just ignore that content? Open to both of you. Where do you start with that?
I can start, and Meredith, please continue to add, because we both face this together. Mm-hmm. So we realize that the US market is very different from some of the other markets outside of US. In US, a lot of pharma website content is open or partially gated, where you are able to just do an attestation and log in and see the content. But there are completely fully gated websites when it comes to some of the European markets, where all of the pharma content is behind a login. When an HCP has to create a login based on their NPI or their professional number, and that's when they see the content. So I think a key thing to note is LLMs respect fully logged on or gated content. LLMs do not crawl that content at all. That is something that we 100% know. So we have very little authority in some of these affiliates that are heavily regulated in terms of how we put our content. And in that scenario, I think what we have urged our markets and brand teams to think about is figure out what content can you ungate, right? It is easy to just put everything in the gated place. It is easy to just never question the regulations. It is easy to continue what we have been doing for the last 10 years. But I think that's where we need to challenge the status quo. We need to say, okay, what out of this content can I compliantly ungate? So I have HCPs and they ask a question. So if an HCP is sitting in, say, I don't know, Germany, asking a question about a brand, they will end up with US information because I can't control how LLM script the content, which is not compliant in a way. So to make it more compliant, figure out ways to ungate some of your content for the Germany audience. It could be as simple as putting your PI more, or your SMPC as they call it in Europe, in an HTMLized format in an ungated way. Somehow drive the traffic to those things to get the ranking up, do better SEO if you're not doing it, but do better content first architecture. There are still opportunities, less, but there are still opportunities in this fully gated markets as well.
Nice. And just building on what Mansi just said, we know and we've seen firsthand that these models, they are trained largely on US-centric English data. And as a result, we do see a US bias and an English bias in a lot of the answers. And that's why I think the approach that Mansi and her team took with this project in not just looking at one market, but really looking at 7 markets holistically was really powerful, because it allowed us to see how the different LLMs are surfacing information in different markets and understand really truly how that global ecosystem was working, also connecting the dots on places where we could take a more global approach to what was showing up on websites or in things like press releases that we may have less challenges with, at least in terms of like a gating content standpoint. So, I do think that when there are opportunities to take a more global versus like a one market approach when looking at GEO, it's really important and effective.
And how, I guess, would you operationalize that? Because I'm looking at a lot of attendees, and we've got folks from medical, we've got folks that I know are like have lived SEO for the last 20 years. We've got folks in marketing, we've got folks in digital, we've got folks in brand. Like, I guess part one is like, is it going to be a standalone function? Or part B, where does it sit? And part C, advice for, how do we make this part of kind of, I guess, our comms in general? Sorry, there are a lot of questions there.
No, absolutely. And I think that's fantastic. And I do want to say that this is new for everyone, right? That nobody has a ton of experience doing this. But I do not believe GEO, at least from my perspective, is going to be a separate function or a center of excellence. And I think I did mention this during the presentation itself, is we need to incorporate GEO best practices within our current processes and functions. It is not something that sits outside. So for example, the medical teams, the publications team, as they are deciding and defining their publication strategy, they have to keep those GEO insights in mind. They have to understand those content gaps that they are seeing, and then define their publication strategy on how they are going to pull forward those publications. That's one thing. As brand teams prepare content, for the websites, they have to think about those gaps, and they have to create the content based on the gaps and to answer those questions that are being asked from our customers to these LLMs. So it has to be incorporated within our current ways of working versus creating a completely separate function who owns and defines like GEO. That's not going to help. So we are currently in process of creating this operating model and incorporating this in our current processes. That is the best way, in my opinion, to move forward.
I also think that when we do the landscape audit, that is such a critical point when there's a real opportunity to bring a cross-functional team to the table and really rally everyone together with a shared understanding of the data and insights. And so that's where I do think making that investment in a comprehensive audit can be such a critical point to then develop a cohesive strategy.
Nice. And what about some top tips? You kind of both touched on them throughout in terms of, making content that you can outside the gate, looking at FAQs, trying to get placements in like respected publications, all of these kind of top tips. And obviously everything moves every day in the AI world. But I guess, Meredith, you live and breathe this for a variety of clients. Like, are there different types of or specific content that is most likely to win in AI systems today? And I won't quote you on the answer in a year, I promise.
No, I think you were mentioning some of the best practices we talk to clients about regularly, but we've also seen there is a lot of nuance, and what works and what doesn't can really vary depending on the therapeutic category, whether you're looking at this from a corporate standpoint or from a brand standpoint. So, while I think it's really important to ensure that the teams have incorporated those best practices into, as Nancy was saying, existing processes, et cetera, it's also important to know what's different or unique from a challenge or opportunity standpoint to your therapeutic area. And that's where I think you'll see brands and companies really start to gain competitive edge in this space. Because it will allow them to try something maybe new or different than what, I think we'll see more and more companies start to adopt from a best practices standpoint. And I think, one really powerful example is what Monty and the team have done from a publication standpoint, because, that is publications are consistently one of the most cited sources across LLMs. So Monty, I'll let you talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So fundamentally, as we were doing pilots and running pilots across the world, not just for US, we realized that PubMed was the number one cited source for most of our disease state and brand discussions, right? Which inadvertently means that AIs rank content that is from authors that have credentials higher than other authors, right? So because these publications are peer reviewed by healthcare professionals, AI tends to rank them higher when they are putting the answer together and citing the answer. So again, I think I'm going to repeat the same thing, just making sure that your peer-reviewed content is out there, making sure if you have content on your websites that has been reviewed by an internal or an external healthcare professional, make sure you put the credentials of the author right there. It's just as simple as that, because AI is then going to rank it higher than the other parts of the other content on your website. I think some very practical examples, low-hanging fruits is having a published date on your content, because AI will rank your published date higher. If you have recency is really mattering to AI right now. More recent content is ranked higher than the lowest. And these are some like really low-hanging fruits. And I think I did mention one thing ahead was the HTMLization. So pick certain key content. I'm not saying you have to convert everything from PDF to HTML. That's crazy. Because tomorrow we'll probably know, oh, LLMs are crawling PDFs as well now. So to pick some top pieces of content, convert them into HTML, because we know at this point LLMs crawl HTML content more. And I think the last one that I keep saying to everyone is, if you have videos, because obviously videos are a very easy way of engagement for our healthcare professionals, like tidbits of video, make sure you have a transcript next to it, because the LLM is not going to read through the video, but it will read through the transcript, and your answer will be determined based on that transcript. So I gave you some really good tidbits, for anyone who's trying to optimize their content here. This is very valuable. Something that we have learned with last 6 months of analysis, Med, I guess synthesized into a few minutes.
So in the last 6 months then, what do you wish, one thing from each of you that you wish you knew when you started this?
Interesting question.
Because there's a lot of people on the phone and a lot of people that are messaging me saying, where do I start?
I think it's a challenging question, because we've learned so much along the way. That was really, I think, an important part of the journey for both of our teams. It's a space, Monty, you said this a few times, and it's so important to recognize this is new to everyone. And, I don't think that anything is set in stone. It's constantly evolving. So I think the important thing to always keep in mind is that continuing to stay open-minded and be willing to think differently. Like, I think what you were mentioning, Monty, that the team has done in terms of really taking a hard look at what content, for example, can come from behind an interstitial is so important. So I don't know if it's something I wish I would have known from the start, but something I think was critical to success and keeping in mind from the beginning on both sides of our teams is having that open-mindedness to not just look at a challenge and stop there, but truly think about how can we do things differently to adapt to this new world.
Yep. And I think just want to add one thing is, like everything else, start small, right? Don't try to do everything at one go. You cannot. That's just not feasible. Start small and build on top of it. Identify those top actions that you can make to improve your brand presence, and then build on it. Trying to do everything in the first go, making yourself the best in class in first go, it's nearly impossible because we are in this LLM AI world. So start small and build.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much. We really appreciate the time it takes to put this together and for sharing everything you've learned on this journey so far. So yeah, a huge thank you to Meredith and Mansi for all your help today. And a huge thank you, I guess, from us at Pharma Brands. So our focus is improving AI literacy in healthcare. So this is very pertinent to us right now. And obviously we do this by delivering training and events in person and virtually across the world. And we have a huge second half. So please do go to our website, pharmabrands.ca, because we have lots going on, whether that's in person, whether you're in the US, whether you're in Europe, we've got stuff going on everywhere. And yes, the question I always get asked is, will you get an email with this recording? Yes, you will. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.